Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria and in today's video I'm going to be talking all things A Court of Silver Flames as revealed by Sarah J Maas on the February 24th virtual stop of her tour for this book. So let's get into it. I mentioned on Instagram that I would be attending the February 24th leg of the Sarah J Maas A Court of Silver Flames tour, and I asked you guys if you'd be interested in a video about it, and overwhelmingly the answer was yes. So here's this video. I managed to screen record the event, so I will go through the questions that she was asked and then share clips of what she was saying. I'm not sure how much I can share in order to be in accordance with the fair use policies, so I will be giving a summary and showing clips where I can. She talked quite a bit about her process writing this book, as well as where the inspiration came from and what's next for her. The first question she was asked was, why do you want to tell the story of Nesta and Cassian? Sarah talked about how from the beginning she always was really interested in their chemistry together, and so after the series had ended and she was thinking about where are these characters now, she was most interested immediately in Nesta and Cassian because of that chemistry.
Weirdly enough, I began writing this while I was still writing A Court of Wings and Ruin, the third book in the series, and at the time, this was like years ago, I was contracted only to write 3 books in the series. It was supposed to end with Wings and Ruin, and just for fun, as I was working on this supposedly final book in the series, I decided to look ahead and be like, well, what happens after they defeat the evil guy? And Nesta and Cassian had this crazy chemistry from the start, and so they were just the first characters that I wanted to know what they were doing after the events of the first 3 books. So I just began writing it for fun, on the side as this secret project that I didn't plan to publish. It was almost like writing fan fiction of my own stuff in a way. But then I worked on it in secret for months and thought about what I wanted to do next with the series. And then I went out to a dinner with my editor in Chicago, and I got a little wasted, just a little bit. And I wound up drunkenly pitching her these books because she and I were knee deep in working on Wings and Ruin, and she wanted to know what happened to all these characters after the series wrapped up. And so I was like, well, let me tell you what happens to Nesta and Cassian. Over the course of a couple hours, I kind of just rambled and explained to her what I wanted to do with this book, what I saw the other characters doing beyond this, and I then forgot all about it. And then 2 weeks later, my agent called me and was like, did you pitch books to your editor when you were in Chicago? And I was like, oh yeah, I totally forgot that. And my agent was like, well, she wants to buy them now, so let's talk about this deal. And I had realized at that point that I really wanted to tell not just this story about Nesta and Cassian, but also I wanted to tell the stories of all these other characters who were in the earlier books as kind of side characters, and I wanted to explore this world and explore this idea of, what happens when the big battle has been defeated. At the end of Wings and Ruin, their world is in ruins, basically. The wall is collapsed. The borders between humans and the Fae are gone, and the power between humans and Fae is, there's a huge difference. The Fae have all this power, humans have none. What comes out of that world when the borders are gone? Who tries to make a play for power? And then how will Rhys and Feyre and their court rise to meet that challenge? Do they involve themselves in it? Do they decide it's not their problem? And I couldn't stop thinking about these things. And at the core of it for this first story was just Nesta and Cassian, and that chemistry between them, but also so many unanswered questions about Nesta's power and why she became the way she is.
The next question the interviewer asked was about Nesta's likability. The interviewer described how she didn't like Nesta at first and found her character very difficult. So Sarah was asked, how did you develop Nesta as a character? And how did you develop her rage? From the beginning, Sarah described being fascinated with Nesta because even though she was clearly angry on the surface, Sarah knew she had a lot going on underneath and was very interested in the fact that Nesta was the only character who could see through Tamlin's facade. As well, Sarah herself was going through a journey of anxiety and depression about the same time that she was writing this book, so she really got to explore her own journey through Nesta's. Sarah talked about how she came to a point where her anxiety had become full-blown panic attacks. She finally finally came to a place where she thought she couldn't go on living this way, so she went to therapy and got the medication that she required. So in that sense, the goal of this book wasn't to convince readers to like Nesta, but rather to bring Nesta to a place where the end of her story is really her beginning, and she can look back on her past and face the things that she did wrong while having the courage to not let those things define her.
I kind of knew from the start, Nesta was a lot more than we were seeing. She wasn't just, this bitchy older sister. You find out in Acotar that she's actually the one person that was able to see through Tamlin's glamour, and she tried to go save Feyre. And I just found that to be so fascinating to me. This someone who is very closed off and appears like she doesn't care, but she does care. She cares deeply and doesn't know how to process a lot of those emotions. When it came time to actually work on this book in terms of like my contract and needing to work on it, I decided to kind of throw out the pages that I had written years ago when this was just a fun project and start basically from page one, because during those years I had learned so much more about Nesta, about what made her tick, but also at the time I was going through like a really rough patch in my own personal life with my own mental health. I now realize that I had lived with a lot of these things for many years. I'd suffered from major anxiety, PTSD type stuff, like depression, like all of that, and I had always bottled it up. And I never thought that I actually had a problem. I thought this is just how I am. This is how I move through the world. And then there came a point where things got worse and worse and worse for me. And I began having panic attacks. And I was just at the point where I could not bear to be this way for another moment. So finally, after years of thinking, how what I was feeling was okay, I decided to go to therapy. So I started going to therapy. I got on medication. I started meditating, exercising, doing yoga, and I went on this journey that weirdly and coincidentally happened to be a very similar journey to what Nesta was going on. As I was writing her journey, I was also going through it. And it allowed me this really intense sort of insight into her head. And, none of what she goes through is autobiographical in any way, but there are parts of this book where I really had to essentially open up a vein and bleed all over it. It was wonderful and exhausting. And my goal with this book was kind of the same goal that I had for myself, which was to get Nesta and myself to a point where, the ending it's not an ending for them. It's the beginning of their life as someone who can understand themselves and reflect on themselves and face everything that they've done in the past. And I didn't want to write about a heroine who was nice and perfect and everyone loved her. Like, that's not interesting to me. I wanted Nesta to be that character that it's not that I didn't want her to be redeemed in the eyes of readers. I wanted her to go on a journey where she herself could look back and understand what she had done to harm others, to harm herself, the environment that had led her to behave that way, in the same way that we're all kind of a product of our past. Like my own journey and like the journey of so many people that I know struggling with mental health, there are good days and bad days, and it's a roller coaster where sometimes you make progress, sometimes you fall back, and I didn't want it to be an easy journey for Nesta. I didn't want to let her off the hook. I wanted her to have done things that she was ashamed of, in the same way that I'm sure, 99% of the people watching this, we've all done stuff that we're not entirely proud of. And how do you face that? How do you face yourself? How do you face the people that you've harmed? And what kind of courage does that take to face those things inside of yourself? And how do you move on? Where do you go from there? Are you defined by the past, or can you, if not reinvent yourself, just not let the past define you anymore and decide who you want to be?
Next, the interviewer asked about Cassian and said, has he always been that guy? Sarah said she's always had a soft spot for that tall, goofy guy that seems tough but is really soft on the inside. She says her husband is this kind of person, and Cassian, for that reason, was really a joy for her to write. She talked a lot about how Cassian was really a character that Nesta could learn something from because he had lived for so long and suffered really the worst of human or fae experiences and had always managed to keep an optimistic outlook. He's very open about the impact of his past and his recovery process, but it doesn't define who he is now.
I've come to realize that I have a giant soft spot when it comes to like the tall, goofy guys who seem like they're tough, but they're really just like big old softies. My weird celebrity crush is on Rob Gronkowski from our American Gronk. It's I've got the hots for him. Like, I don't know if you guys know who he is, like, in Canada, but he's like...
Yeah,
just,
no,
like,
we know. Well, I know you.
I spent the entire Super Bowl just, like, staring at his ass on the screen and, like, texting my friend being like, oh my god, he's so hot. My friend was like, Gronk? Like, what? And I just, like, I have a thing for that type of guy, I guess. And so Cassian just kind of, I guess, sprung out of that part of my head that gravitates toward... I think I married a guy like that. Like, my husband is that guy. Like, he's always smiling and, like, he's tall, I guess. And I've got a thing for those, like, lovable softies. And Cassian, I don't, like, when he walked onto the page in Mist and Fury, I just loved him. Like, I loved him, and I got him maybe even in ways that I didn't quite immediately get, like, other characters. He just kind of was there, and he's such a joy for me to write. And it also was so interesting for me to write because he's been around he's like 500 years old, and Nesta is like in her 20s, and so he's been through a lot of stuff. He has seen a lot of stuff. He has, endured some of the worst things that humans can face, and yet he's still positive and kind and loving towards the people in his life. And he was just a character that Nesta could learn so much from, because he doesn't really let the past define him and destroy him, and he's open about the impact it's had on him on the times that it's taken him years to recover from stuff he's seen.
Next, the interviewer was straight up like, so tell me about their sex.
So tell me a little bit about their sex. Because there's some steaminess there, let me tell you.
Sarah talked a lot about how she writes in a linear fashion, so the sex scenes arise when the characters need those scenes to fulfill an emotional moment in the plot. So as much as she likes to write them for fun, it's not just about smut for smut's sake. She also talked a lot about how awkward it is that her family reads her books even though she tells them not to. When she's writing, she has to turn off that part of her brain that reminds her that her family will read them, and she talked about how as much as she doesn't like it when her mother reads them, it's even worse when her father does. There was one time when she called her mother and was like, you need to stop Dad from reading this right now. The first true sex scene she ever wrote was in Acotar. True sex scene meaning not the young adult fade to black technique, but sex on the page. And she described how she had to get some red wine and just get a little bit drunk to get through it. Because the whole time she was just thinking, oh my gosh, so dirty, my family.
I write in a linear fashion, so, every sex scene is, I write it as their relationship is developing and unfolding. I feel like I need to discuss the fact that my father is reading this book right now.
Oh.
And I was on the phone with my mother yesterday, and I was like, Mom, I don't care what the happens, but you need to get that book out of his hands right now. You need to take that book away from him. And she's like, no, like, he doesn't mind that stuff. It's okay. And I was like, Mom, take the book away and throw it in the street. Do not let him read any further in this book. And my mom, I don't think she gets it. And I said to her, I was like, Mom, like, I don't mind if you read it. Like, yeah, like, it's, might be a little weird, but, like, there's a big difference for me from, like, my mother reading these sex scenes versus, like, my father reading them. And, like, because it is, this book is by far the most graphic of any I've written. And this is my second adult book after Crescent City came out last year. And, this one's adult in every possible way. But I didn't just have the sex scenes there for, like, shock value. Like, all the moments with them. And I think maybe this is because I write in this linear way, like, they're all closely tied to their emotional journey. Like, the first time they kiss, it's, at this moment, like, where they're just, like, clashing emotionally. And then, like, another one of the scenes that I won't spoil for you guys, but involves a sexual act done in the dining room. It's actually a moment where Nesta tries to comfort Cassian in a way, and she's being vulnerable, and her sexuality is a way for her to express things in a language that she can't maybe verbally say, but physically she can. And she finds a freedom in expressing her sexuality. And she just enjoys it. Like, she enjoys having sex. And I wanted to write about that. When I'm writing these scenes, I have to shut off that voice in my head that's like, your family's going to read this. How are you going to look at your grandma again? Because they all insist on reading my books, even though I tell them again and again. Like, 1, you guys don't read romance. 2, you guys don't read fantasy. And 3, there is graphic sex in my books, and I am deeply uncomfortable with you guys reading them. And they still, like, God bless them, like, they still insist on reading them, but I have to turn off that voice in my head when I'm writing them. And the first time I ever wrote a sex scene was, I think, like an on the page sex scene, not like fade to black. I think it was when I was working on Acotar. And for that, I literally had to pour myself a glass of red wine and get a little tipsy, because I was used to writing, kind of relatively clean young adult books until that point. And then I was like, oh, this is so dirty. Like, how do I and now I do not require alcohol to write these scenes. It just becomes awkward when I'm writing about bodily fluids and stuff with people in the room, like family members in the room, and I'm punched over my computer, like talking about, throbbing erection or whatever. Gets a little awkward then.
After that discussion, the interviewer asked about Sarah's world building and asked her how she sets up these worlds, whether or not she puts a lot of planning into it or if she discovers it as she's going. Sarah said that she tends to have a basic idea for the world, and that gets her started on the writing, but then the details come about as she's exploring the characters. So for example, she'll think about what a character's favorite thing to eat for breakfast is, and if it's fruit, then she next asks, where does that fruit come from? What are the trade routes like? What are the businesses like? What's the economy like? And so that one detail about the character takes her down a whole world building tangent. She shared that the inspiration for the Weaver in Acotar came from a trip she took to New Zealand, where she was driving through this really creepy old forest full of gnarly trees, and it just felt alive with the idea that there was some hideous crone living at the center of it. She talked a lot about how, in that sense, the fairy tale part of her brain, as she called it, is always switched on, and there's a part of her that's always living in that fairy tale land. She said she's always taking notes wherever she goes, always writing down ideas for worlds and for things that could exist in her worlds, or even just feelings for characters. So she talked about how when she's ill sometimes, like let's say with a fever, she'll be so ill but still deciding to stop and write down what it feels like to be that sick, just in case she needs to use it. Like with the trip to New Zealand, she talked a lot about how travel is also very inspiring for her. Again, on another trip to New Zealand, she took a hike through the mountains, which is the hike that actually inspired the hike in A Court of Silver Flames. She talked about how she was going on this hike with her husband and suddenly felt in some way like she was Nesta, in a kind of like method acting sense, and she really just experienced it with the character of Nesta.
I usually get like a vague idea of the world, but then once I'm actually writing it and these characters, the characters are a part of their world in the same way that we are a part of our world. And so everything, I want to know everything from what do they eat for breakfast every day? Like, I want to know those random things, but then if they're eating a fruit salad every morning, I want to know where that fruit comes from in the world. If they're in a northern climate where they don't have tropical fruit, what are the trade routes like that get the tropical fruit? Where does the tropical fruit come from? What's that culture like? What are their trade deals like? And these things might not make it into the book, but these are like the questions I start asking myself as I'm writing. And with each round of edits, the editing process takes well over a year for these books. And with each round, I ask myself more and more questions. And sometimes I feel like I stumble across little random details that are lurking in the back of my mind in some kind of like weird, like magical place. The Weaver in the Wood in ACoSF, like that. I was in New Zealand at the time, and I was on this really cool day trip through Doubtful Sound, just this like beautiful like fjord lands, like mountains rolling into the water. And we drove through some really like old, creepy looking forests on our way to the water. And I mean, they were the trees were all very close together and like knotted and like had like lichen growing all over them. And it just was like a weird, like beautiful, but like intense place. And I still have the notes on like the app on my phone from like me just literally having to stop everything and write down the details of that place, because there was something about it that connected with that like fairy tale part of my mind. And I thought about in the middle of that, like a forest like that, some like hut where this horrible creature lived, and thus like the Weaver in the Wood was kind of born from that. So it's like kind of a combination of me thinking through things and asking myself questions, and then these moments of inspiration either from some random place in my mind or like literally traveling around the world and taking notes as I go. And there's a hike in this book. Nesta and Cassian take this hike through the mountains, and that was inspired by my second trip to New Zealand. New Zealand inspires like literally everything that I write. But I was staying at this amazing property, just kind of right above Queenstown, but it's got the hundreds of thousands of acres of untouched mountains in New Zealand. that you're free to explore. And it's the most beautiful place I've ever been in my life. And one day my husband and I decided to hike one of the trails. And as I was going, like, I was not in shape. I was sweating. I was carrying like a giant pack on my back. And we had the baby. Like, our son was like a little baby then. And, like, we were hauling him along, and the ground was very rocky. And I just slipped into this place in my mind where I didn't intentionally do this, but all of a sudden I was Nesta, like, and Nesta was going on a hike with Cassian in these mountains. And, like, what was it like with each step? Like, what did she feel like? Were there pebbles in her shoe? What did the sun feel like? What did it feel like to carry the pack? And it's almost like method acting in a way. Like, I wasn't speaking as if I was Nesta, but I kind of almost channeled her in that moment. And I was, typing notes as I went, which wasn't great with, like, the rocks on the ground, and carrying a baby. No babies were harmed in the making of this book, I promise. And that's why I love to travel, because moments like that where I didn't go on a hike to inspire myself. I just went on a hike because I wanted to see this beautiful land. And my brain just leapt to that connection of, like, oh, what if it was Nesta going on this hike? Like, what would she feel? And what's the color of the river down below? And what does the wind feel like? And so the world building is kind of comes from all these different places that, I try to make feel real by adding in, like, some of those things, like, what's the color of the water down below? And I'm constant, if you, like, see me, like, walking through my everyday life, like, I'm always, like, on my phone typing notes about little things. Even when I'm sick, like, if I'm sick and, like, pre-COVID times, like, if I'm, like, was sick with something, I would, even in the middle of my agony, I'll be, like, taking notes of, like, what it feels like to have a fever and chills and cramps. Those are, like, real experiences and, like, real details that I can throw into my books.
Following from that, the interviewer noted the inspiration of folklore in a lot of Sarah's books and asked about whether that just came from constantly reading things or where the mythology really comes from. Sarah talked a lot about how she was always a fairy tale nerd and a mythology nerd, and so it does come a lot from reading things. She likes the idea that fairy tales came from a time when people didn't have language or knowledge necessarily to interpret the world around them, so they turned those feelings and fears into stories. Like the Kelpie scene in A Court of Silver Flames, she talked about how the original draft of that was actually almost identical to what made it into the final version, and that came from that sort of fascination with fairy tales. She essentially sat down and wrote, asking herself, what would terrify the crap out of me if I were there? And from that question, the scene was born.
I was a fairy tale folklore junkie as a little kid, and even growing up, in college, or I took classes on Russian folklore and stuff like that. I love world mythologies, and I think there is, like, a place in my brain that just is constantly in that fairy tale mode. And I like the fairy tales that, aren't cleaned up. Like, I like the ones that are really messy and terrifying, and, that kind of served as warnings and education for people during a time when they couldn't understand or they didn't even have terminology in a way for things like, bad weather or, like, predatory men and stuff like that. And I find myself always drawn back to those stories and those creatures and the things that really scare me. Like, I don't want to spoil things with this book, but the Kelpie, that whole scene with the Kelpie is one of my favorite scenes that I've ever written. I think because it took me to a place. It was really good. That's why I loved it. It took me to a place of such primal terror. It scared me half to death, but even as I was scared, I was scared. I was freaking myself out writing it, which sounds absurd, but, like, I was just so into it, and I thought of, like, the thing that would terrify me. Like, what would terrify me in that moment? And that whole scene, what you read in the book is pretty much, like, untouched from what I wrote in that first draft, which is very rare for me. Like, I rewrite and edit, like, a lot, but that scene just poured out of me. And I think because I could tap into, one, that love of, like, fairy tale, like, mythology creatures, and I was kind of geeking out over it, but two, because I just got into that scene and I was in Nesta's head. And by the time that scene finishes, again, like, no spoilers, but, like, the way that scene ends was like a mic drop for me, where I, like, was just like, bam, like, and I jumped up from my seat and I was like, yes, yes, and I was so amped up. And those are the experiences that I live for when I'm writing, when I, like, literally lose sense of place and time, and I am, like, in that scene with my characters, and then, like, I write it exactly the way it's in my brain, and, like, I get to that last line and I'm just like, yeah, like it feels like I just like scored a touchdown. Like I'm like, Gronk.
Next, the interviewer asked about the scene where Aelin is falling through the worlds and sees Feyre and Rhysand, and asked whether there is going to be some sort of crossover. Sarah talked about how she sees all of her books in kind of a megaverse where there are different worlds that are accessible through a gate. The original draft of A Court of Silver Flames actually included a scene from Rhys's perspective where he sees Aelin falling, but unfortunately it was removed. Apparently her editor suggested, and Sarah agreed, that it didn't really make sense for the entire story to be about Nesta's arc and then suddenly switch to Rhysand for just 5 pages. She also mentioned, in case we didn't catch it, that in the same way Aelin sees Rhys and Feyre, she also sees the world of Crescent City.
I've always said that this series exists in like a megaverse where you can, like in Front of Glass, open a word gate and walk into another world. And what's funny, and I feel like I kind of regret this, is in the first draft of this book, I had the scene in there where
looking for it.
Yeah,
I was like, wait, where is it?
Scene. Yeah, so I had the scene in there where Rhys sees Aelin, and like it's like this whole moment. Not where like nothing, like he's not like, hey, like it's just like that moment where he's like having this romantic thing with his mate, and then like a girl falls through the sky, and like what does he do and feel in that moment? And my editor is a genius and very wisely pointed out that to go from like all Nesta narrative to suddenly switch to like a 5-page scene from like Rhys's point of view was like very jarring and weird. And so I took it out after much debating. But so right now there's just a vague mention of like Rhys seeing some kind of star burning in the sky or something. Like he kind of hedges it to people where he's like, oh, I saw a star, and it weirded me out. He doesn't tell people like, hey, I saw a girl like fall through the sky. Like, what happened? What's going on? But funny enough, so when Aelin's falling through the worlds at the end of Throne of Glass, she sees Rhys and Feyre, but then she also goes through the Crescent City world. Like, none of the characters are mentioned, but there's like a line in there that talks about like this like city, like high towers on like a curve of like a moon-shaped curve of the river or something. Yes. I forget what the line is.
So I was thinking that too. I mean, so I was like, I wonder if that's, but I hadn't known that.
You're a very smart reader.
Next, Sarah was asked which of her 4 female protagonists she most identifies with. She said for her it's Nesta's emotional journey. Her parents think she's Aelin, but personally, she thinks on the whole she's most like Bryce. She talked about how some of her outrageous college experiences made it into Bryce's story, but really how all of her heroines share some key aspect of her. She said that in order for her to really get into someone's head, she has to feel that special connection with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like Nesta's journey in an emotional way I probably identify with the most. Personality-wise, I don't know. I feel like everyone who knows me would have a different answer. Like, my parents have been like, you're totally Aelin, and I'm like, no, that's not true. But I feel like I'm the most like Bryce. Like, a lot of my drunken college experiences made their way into like Bryce's life. That's all I'll say about that. I feel like out of all of them, probably Bryce, but I feel like it changes like every day. Like, some days I feel more like a Feyre. It's kind of like Sex in the City. It's like, are you a Charlotte or Samantha? Like, are you a Feyre or an Aelin? And it kind of changes for me. For all of my heroines, I have to have some really intense thread of connection to them in order to get into their heads. And so they all get these pieces of me in a way. So, yeah, like, don't quote me on this answer, guys that are watching. Because I feel like I'm saying, like, Nesta and Bryce right now because they're the ones whose books I've been working on the most recently, but you know, I guarantee if I start writing another Throne of Glass book or like a book from Feyre's point of view, I'll be like, I connect with them the most. And I know that's kind of like a cop-out answer. We'll just say like college-wise, like real life experience-wise, let's say Bryce. Like minus like, you know, my best friend being murdered and like horrible things happening to me.
No
like
Danica, no wolf pack, no nothing like that happening.
No.
Next, she was asked what research she does for the fight scenes. She said that normally it's just visualization, but for this book, she was actually working with a personal trainer at the time. She knew that he had a background in martial arts, so she asked him about sword fighting, and apparently the next time she had a class, he showed up with practice swords and taught her a few things. So when we see Nesta learning the very basics of fighting, right down to just beginning with the balance and working with her toes, apparently this is all something Sarah experienced as well with her personal trainer. After every lesson, she would go home and take notes about what part of her body hurt, where she was feeling things, what she'd experienced, and all of that became part of Nesta's journey.
I usually picture them in my mind. That's about as much as research as I will do. But with this book, Nesta was kind of my first heroine who isn't highly trained. You know, Feyre knew how to use a bow and arrow. Like, Bryce is like, you know, a sharpshooter, like, you know, warrior, and then Aelin's like an assassin. Like, so, and I deliberately wanted to write about heroines in the past who had those skills, so I didn't really have to do too much research about like how they would train and do them. I couldn't get around that with Nesta, and at the time, this was pre-COVID, I was working with a personal trainer who also happens to do a bunch of martial arts stuff, like specifically like with swords. And like during one of our workout sessions, I mentioned to him like, hey, like you do like sword stuff. Like I'm writing a book about like a girl who's just like me, like lazy and weak. And like, what's it like to learn how to use a sword? Like, can someone like me learn how to use a sword? And the next session, he showed up with this wooden practice sword. And I was like, can I have a real sword? And he was like, no. And if that sounds very similar to a scene in ACoSF, it's because that happened to me. And and so he began walking me through some of the basic movements and poses. And I was shocked at how much it wasn't just like moving my arms around. Like it required like my whole body, like, and it required everything from like my toes and my balance, like up to my head, but then also just repeating these motions over and over again until they become muscle memory. And then after each session, when I drag my carcass home, like I would take notes about, okay, what parts of my body feel sore? And like, then I would tell my trainer, you know, oh, like my, you know, whatever was so sore after our session. And he would say, well, that meant you were doing something wrong because like you should be feeling somewhere else. So this book was just very immersive. Like I like kind of lived through the training with Nesta. And I'm not a sword master, but like COVID happened. And so that kind of was interrupted. But just going through those initial stages of learning not just how to handle a weapon, but to respect it and how it works with your body, that was kind of like the most like intense research I've ever done because I physically went through it. The first time I ever went in with my trainer, he was like, okay, take off your sneakers and your socks. And I was like, what are you talking about? I haven't had a pedicure in months. Like I can't take off my socks. And he was like, nope, take them off because we need to learn about your feet and like how you're balancing on your feet. And I was like, are you like, what's wrong with you? Like, do you have some weird foot fetish? No, he just like, he explained to me like, you know, start at the feet. We start with your balance. And like, I thought, okay, like I'm really paying you for this, bro. Like balance and my feet, like cut to the end of the lesson. And I've done like nothing except try to balance and fall over and sweat. And like, I didn't even do anything. And I thought that was so fascinating that it had to work its way into this book. Like I had to write it down. Like I was so fascinated by my own physical discovery of like how pathetic my body is that I had to put it in there.
Next, the interviewer asked Sarah if Nesta had a beast form like the other High Lords, what would hers be? And Sarah said it would be some sort of combination of a snow leopard but with golden wings and silver or iron talons. Beautiful but terrifying.
I feel like it would be something like maybe feline, like a snow leopard type thing, but with like golden wings and like silver claws and like iron teeth. Like she would be beautiful but absolutely terrifying and like very feminine, but also like completely like predatory. And like she'd be like the kind of thing where you'd be like, oh, that's so beautiful in like a mesmerizing way, and you would be so struck by her beauty that you wouldn't even realize until she had her jaws around your throat. She's gonna eat you. I kind of like the Sphinx, like, you know, like where it's like that combination of like beauty and like animal and like, I don't know, something else. Yeah, I don't know. Like I feel like someone more artistically inclined needs to come up with this, because like in my head, like I feel like what I'm picturing would wind up being like when Napoleon Dynamite draws a liger, like like this sad looking thing.
Following that, Sarah was asked what she's working on now, and she said she is deep in the middle of Crescent City 2 edits, and that she's excited for us to see side characters get more of their own arcs and for the world to really open up.
So I am knee-deep in edits on Crescent City 2. Yeah, I'm getting my next round of edits tomorrow or Friday maybe. So like I got this week off a little bit to enjoy this book being out. But yeah, I am like focused on Crescent City 2, and I'm really excited about it because a lot of the side characters get their own plot lines in this book, in addition to Bryce and Hunt. And the book, it's still very much in its early stages, but I really am excited about how it opens up the world, and how in opening up the world of Crescent City for you guys, like you get to see a lot more out of these characters and like what they're made of and how they clash together romantically and as enemies.
Next, she was asked if it's weird to write during COVID, and she said it was hard at first because she had a lot of trouble focusing when we weren't really sure what was going on in the world or if society was collapsing. And then her husband lost his grandfather to COVID, which was a deep emotional impact on their family. Even though she got back in the swing of writing, she said that she sometimes feels guilt to be able to escape to these fantasy worlds and just play around and enjoy her imagination when people have lost their jobs and their loved ones and are really struggling.
It was really hard for me at first when we weren't sure what this was, how COVID was passed along. I wasn't when we weren't sure if society was about to collapse. Like I had a lot of trouble working, and then my husband's grandfather wound up passing away from COVID in April, and it was that was a pretty devastating, hard thing to go through. And those initial few months I really struggled with, one, focusing, but then two, anytime I sat down, I had this feeling of guilt almost at going off to play in these fantasy worlds when so many people were suffering, not just from the virus, but also from the losing their jobs and all the uncertainty. And I really had to struggle to find that place in myself creatively again. Now I'm able to I've adapted and I'm able to work each day, but it's still, there are some days when I'm just like, who cares about books? These horrible things are happening in the world. But it's also been as guilty as I felt at times during the beginning of this when I was writing. I've also been incredibly grateful that I have these worlds to kind of escape to and to process everything that's happening in our world, in this fantasy world.
And finally, Sarah was asked what further plans there are for the Acotar series. She said that she has the next book pretty much completely planned out in her head, and she knows the characters that it will focus on. Personally, I'm guessing it will be Elaine, Azriel, and Lucian, but that has not been confirmed. She said that she's not able to work on it yet because she has obligations to other projects, but as soon as her calendar tells her it's time to go, she will begin drafting that.
I know who the next book in Acotar world is about. I've got it all plotted out up here.
Awesome.
I've had some friends texting me. They're like crazy conspiracy theories about what will happen, and I'm getting a real kick out of those. I feel like I shouldn't say it here because I feel like my publishing team would want to weigh in on when we announce who the next book
No, it's just good to know that it's in there, even if it's in there.
It's in the queue. It is lined up. As soon as it comes onto my official calendar to start drafting that book, I will be in that book, and I am super pumped for it. And I'm not sure when that book will be out. I'm psyched.
So that is it for this video. I hope that if you weren't able to attend any part of Sarah's tour, you found this information helpful and you enjoyed seeing the little snippets of it that I could include. As always, if you want to support this channel, you can find a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page below. All donations go towards helping me put my music up on streaming platforms. As always, I love you all, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!